check this out. In the super committee, who's the one guy you'd want to talk to for a half hour whose that name was on everyone's lips?
Senator Toomey came up with the potential compromise.
Exactly. He is here for a half hour for an extended post-mortem on exactly what happened. I decided not to read what was written here because there's so many different reactions to what happened, Senator, from we had people saying everybody should resign who was on the super committee. I said, here these guys get elected in what is an increasingly divided country. They get elected by a constituency to go and stand their ground. Right. And when the country itself doesn't know, and we haven't had an election on how we want to proceed here, go down a path one way or go down a path another, what do you expect when you have, so, you know, whether you call it disappointment, cynicism, whatever it is, I don't want to characterize it as anything. I just want to get the real story from you, which I'm excited about hopefully getting today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you're welcome. Did you bring him?
He can go anywhere by himself.
He can.
But I'd love to be with him.
Yeah, excellent. Even John Harwood, I don't know if you saw earlier today, he contrasted your proposal with Boehner's $800 billion, that yours was even more substantive. And I wonder about our viewers at home trying to figure out all this stuff. Yours actually was different went further than what Boehner actually offered.
Well, in some respects, it was a little more specific, I think, than
the 800.
Than that.
What was yours exactly?
You know, a little bit of context. First of all, my own view is we've got a spending problem. This is driven by the big entitlement programs. The president himself has said that healthcare spending by the government is a big driver. This is the source of the problem, and as he's put it, nothing else comes close.
Right.
So we started off asking our Democratic friends, could you agree to making some of the substantial changes we need, the structural reform, architectural reform to the big healthcare programs, Medicare, Medicaid, the others, and we really didn't get much cooperation there.
Is it true, Senator, that they before they talk about any cuts, they wanted to get in the door, they wanted $1 trillion?
Yeah,
so that's true.
It started off at 1.3 trillion, got down to 1.1. At some point, there was
of new revenue.
Yeah.
Taxes.
Yeah. Right. Now, first of all, that can't solve the problem. As I said, I don't think we've got a revenue problem. You could double all revenue from personal individual income taxes, and last year we still would have run a $300 billion deficit. Obviously, you'd crater the economy. So we were hoping we'd get some reform in these programs. But, you know, if we had both gone into our respective foxholes and not shown any willingness to compromise at all, we clearly would have gotten nowhere. I wanted to try to find some common ground. So my thought was to say, there's one way we could conceivably put revenue on the table, and that is if we do it in the context of pro-growth tax reform. If we could reform what everybody acknowledges are ridiculous tax codes, both on the individual and the business side, and use the unlimited jurisdiction of this committee and the procedural opportunity to get anything we produce on the floor of the House and the Senate without obstruction, that would be tremendous. So we developed a framework that suggested that we take the top individual rate down to 28%, use all proportional reduction in all other rates, make the capital gains, dividends, and estate tax rates permanent, the current rates, contract the value of deductions so that not only would you offset the lost revenue from lower rates, but you'd actually generate a net $250 billion in additional tax revenue. Put that on the table together with several other sources of revenue, not dynamically scored economic growth feedback, which I think would happen, but we didn't ask the Democrats to give us credit for that, had a total of $500 billion in revenue, and said, give us $750 billion in actual spending reductions. That adds up to
1.3.
A little over 1.2. With interest savings, you get nearly 1.5. And we said, let's go with the least controversial spending cuts. We had long since given up on the idea of adopting a premium support model for Medicare, which actually solves the problem for Medicare. We had long since given up on the idea of block granting Medicaid to the states, which allows you to solve the fiscal problem there.
The guys you're dealing with, they don't want to go to 28, number one, and they want to do things with dividends and capital gains. So immediately it came out that this is the biggest tax cut for millionaires since Calvin Coolidge. Is that not true?
Against current policy, it's a tax increase.
Because of the deduction.
Because absolutely.
But it depends.
It's a tax increase on the middle class. No.
No, absolutely not. And one of the items that we specified was that we would adjust the dials as needed so that we maintain existing progressivity, and there'd be no net tax increase for anybody at the lower end of the income spectrum.
But Durbin said, I mean, Durbin was positive. Wasn't Kerry sort of like, didn't his eyes sort of go up like maybe this would be something that, who got to these guys that said, because it was not $1 trillion? Was that why?
Yeah, Dick Durbin, who doesn't agree with the framework that I laid out, but nevertheless acknowledged that it was a breakthrough. That was his word.
Right.
And we initially got a lot of interest from our Democratic colleagues on the committee. We actually spent a pretty lengthy, intense meetings trying to build on this framework. I think what they heard from was the left wing of their own caucus that said, you're not going to agree to anything that doesn't include $1 trillion tax increase. Can you imagine with Occupy Wall Street going on all over the country, you're going to agree to something less than $1 trillion tax increase? And one of the things that was so maddening for me, the final last-ditch effort we put on the table, about $644 billion of really non-controversial spending cuts, and almost half of it was revenue, but not tax revenue. It was revenue like asset sales, spectrum sales, that sort of thing. And we put that on the table in the final days, and they said, no, you know what? Unless someone's getting a tax increase, we're not doing anything.
And you pointed out, and I don't think everyone knows, what type of tax increases are coming in 2013?
Oh.
2013, it's how many trillion? It's
if the entire tax increase goes through, it's about $3.8 trillion.
3.8 trillion, and then Obamacare in 2014 is another.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about a 10-year window over 10 years. I think Obamacare it's
more than
huge. Yeah, the spending side. I mean, that's going to be a complete disaster. They've systematically, grossly underestimated the subsidies that will go to people who will lose private insurance and go over to the exchanges. So.
Right. I can tell you here's what I'm just speaking. If you are going to cut back on entitlements for the neediest people, so they need to shoulder the sacrifice.
Right. More burden.
Then it's only fair that folks who can, that folks who can pay more, pay a little bit more. And I'm talking about $1 trillion. Now, you're going to hear that. We're going to hear that so many times over the next 12 months that it's hard to argue with that. I mean, you sound like a good person. You sound like it's a fairness. I mean, why is that? Why not just give a symbolic $1 trillion? Why not go ahead and do it?
Well, because the symbolic $1 trillion will do real damage to the economy. There wouldn't be anything symbolic about that. Well, I know they do, but
you dispute. I mean, they would dispute that. Would $1 trillion in tax increases cause people not to hire?
Unclear. I don't think the evidence suggests that it's the end at all.
No, but without a doubt, this. However you've
seen what we've lived with higher taxes, and we've lived in a better economy with higher taxes before.
And we saw a tremendous surge in economic growth in 2003 when we lowered the tax rates to their current levels. As recently as 2007, with the current tax rates in effect, we had a budget deficit of only 1.2% of GDP, virtually balanced by today's standards.
But people go back, Senator, to the Eisenhower. We had 90% rates in the Eisenhower.
Sure.
They're saying we are at 50-year lows in marginal rates.
And we had even bigger ways to avoid taxes. Nobody was paying effective tax rates of 90%. So as awful as our tax code is today, it's actually, you don't have the same sort of glaring, wide-open loopholes that you had then. It's still enormously problematic. But I just think, as you pointed out earlier, Joe, under current law, if we don't do anything different, the top marginal income tax rates in this country, when you combine state and local with the federal tax rates that are coming, it's well over 50%.
And Andrew, earlier you mentioned that would be an increase of taxes on the middle class. To finally do this,
you may have to across the board.
Well, there's not enough at the high end to.
By the way, there's an enormous amount you could do on the entitlement side to make these programs work and viable without decimating the impact on lower income people. How about we start off by asking wealthy folks who don't need Medicare to pay a little more? And that was part of our plan. How about some means testing in these programs where they pay a little higher premium, have a higher
I think Kerry agreed to doing that, didn't he?
Well, there were these tentative agreements that, yes, maybe if we get that $1 trillion tax increase, we could talk about it.
But isn't it fair to say that the other side comes to the table saying what we need is revenue increases? You come saying we need spending cuts. Isn't it fair to say maybe there's a little bit of both needed? Well, this is not just a spending problem, it's also a revenue problem.
Well, see, I disagree with that fundamentally, but I acknowledge in order to get an agreement, someone was going to have to break from the orthodoxy, and that's why we put revenue on the table. Not because I think we actually need it, but we needed it to hope to be able to reach an agreement. And if we could have had pro-growth tax reform that lowered rates, by the way, we had a provision. We put a lot of time into corporate tax reform. And I thought we had a consensus that we could and should lower the top corporate rate to 25%, go to a territorial system, simplify dramatically. I mean, who doesn't think that that's very, very positive for economic growth?
Right.
We could have done that.
We're going to slip in a break. We're going to get back to all these details because there's a lot more to talk about during this conversation. And later, we're going to talk to Activision CEO Bobby Kotick about Modern Warfare 3. It's one of the hottest video games of the season. We're going to talk gaming and holiday sales in the next half hour. Squawk Box coming back right after this with more of Senator Toomey.